Dr. James Loeffler is the J. Berkowitz Professor of Jewish History at the University of Virginia, where he serves as the Ida Nathan Kolodiz Director of the Jewish Studies Program. His 2018 book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, Jews and Human Rights in the 20th Century, won the American Historical Association's 2019 Dorothy Rosenberg Prize for Best Book, and it really was the best book in the field of Jewish history, and the Association for Jewish Studies. 2019 Jordan Schnitzler Prize for Best Book in the field of modern Jewish history. That's sort of like the triple crown for us scholars in Jewish studies. He co-edits the Association for Jewish Studies Review, the AJS Review, which is the flagship journal in Jewish studies, and serves as the co-ed senior fellow at the Schomburg Institute of North America. His presentation today draws from his path-breaking research on Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jew who coined the term genocide, and his phrases lasting legacy. Jim, outside of your bio, you are one of the most important scholars of Jewish studies. For you to address our community here is my dutiful pleasure to welcome you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let me make sure you can hear me. Yes, I see nods. Okay, good. It's a true pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Elef, and thank you to the team at Gretz College and to the Tuzman family and those who put together this whole teach-in. It's really a remarkable kind of endeavor. I come to you from the University of Virginia, and every university wants to make impact and wants to be able to communicate scholarship to the public. And it's not always easy. So I admire what has taken place today and you know, the larger endeavor of teaching about the Holocaust to all of you, public and scholars, and those who are committed to the meaning of its memory. So I'm going to present to you today. I'm making a note of the time because there are some people joining us for continuing legal education credit, and there are rules for that about time. So we'll make sure we do our work in that area. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen with you. So we can go to the first slide. And having heard about this introduction of me, I come to you from the University of Virginia. I'm a scholar of modern Jewish history and law, and I'm here to talk to you today about Holocaust and law. Now, I want to lay out a few questions and then tell you a story, basically. The questions have to do with the strange moment we live in. We take it for granted today that international law against genocide, right, that we have a law that can stop genocide or wants to purport to do so, is because of the Holocaust. Yet we often debate what's the relationship between the Holocaust and other genocides. We take it for granted that we pursue global justice in the name of the Holocaust, that we are compelled to do it. But there are many people who fear that when we do this, we end up distorting the memory of the Holocaust, right? Or when we want to use it to inspire us to action, but we're also oftentimes very skeptical about others who might use it, or even the ways it can be instrumentalized. We live in a world in which many people believe that the Holocaust has obvious universal lessons about hatred, but many people recoil from the comparisons between anti-Semitism and other kinds of racism, right? And there's almost an anxiety or an outrage about some of the things we hear and some of the ways in which they're related or not related. And finally, we live in a world in which we talk about the rule of law. When democracy is in crisis, we talk about the rule of law. But many of us who do that also ask hard questions about law's power. Is it strong enough to stop evil, to stop unethical behavior and the erosion of democracy? And whether law is impartial, right? Is it strong enough to withstand the politics? So what I want to talk to you about today is how history can inform our thinking about this. And I'm going to do this through talking about Raphael Lemkin, who you heard mentioned in the introduction, and obviously is the topic today. Anti-Semitism, genocide, Holocaust, law, all of these are key parts of his work and his thinking and what led him to create the word genocide. That's a law that is central to what we do in thinking about stopping atrocity. It's a law that faces much debate and controversy about whether it works today. And it's a law that has a backstory which actually isn't very well known. So if I do nothing else with you today, I hope to share some history that's actually surprisingly unknown about how this man, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew, came up with the idea of genocide and what that can tell us about our world today. Now I'll ask Suzette to just switch to the next slide. Now, I want to begin by showing you this poem. And this poem is from 1957. We'll come back to the Genocide Convention, we'll come back to the law, but I want to start with this poem because I think it highlights some of the interesting history as well as some of the perplexing and central questions to thinking about Holocaust and international law. This poem was published in 1957 in an Israeli newspaper. It's by Raphael Lemkin, our hero today. Even if you don't know Hebrew, and even if you don't read the poem, it's worth just looking at that image because what you'll see up there is a poem in Hebrew, and it's a poem that is both clearly about the Holocaust, about anti-Semitism, about the particulars of Jewish suffering, and yet, strictly speaking, it's not about the Holocaust at all. That's because of its title, and the title is, as you see in English in my slide here, Genocide. Not Holocaust, not Shoah, not other Hebrew words that might refer to mass murder, such as Retzach Am or Hashmadat Amim, but the English word genocide written in Hebrew characters. So I want to ask you, as I begin to talk to you, why do you think Lemkin chose that title? And why do you think he decided to write it in Hebrew in that way? Now here, there are people who are obviously in person listening to me speak and those online. I want to invite those online to put your questions. You can put your questions into the chat feature as we go. And part of this hour will be devoted to some Q&A about my presentation and about the questions you have about Holocaust and law and Lemkin and other things. I'll address them as we get towards the end of our hour together, but you're welcome to chime in now. Just send a question through the chat if you have it or make a note. So that's my first question to you. Where's this poem coming from, and what does it mean that he calls it genocide in Hebrew? You can see some of the text of the poem here translated. This is my translation, along with an Israeli colleague. We worked on this when we found it, actually, about 1.5 years ago. Now, one way that people make sense of the story of Raphael Lemkin is that he's a Polish Jew, and he came up with the idea of an international law against atrocity because of anti-Semitism, right? After all, he's born in 1900 in Eastern Europe. He's born in what was the Russian Empire, today is Belarus, and he grows up in basically interwar Poland. And he faces obvious anti-Semitism, persecution, discrimination, and violence. He almost dies during World War I, in fact. Later, nearly his whole family is wiped out during the Holocaust. He narrowly escapes it. So it makes sense that we might simply say anti-Semitism is what causes him to want to create a law against mass murder and to write a poem like this. But just like the poem itself, there's kind of a curious feature of his own thinking and his own biography. And what I'm going to begin to share with you now comes from too many hours spent reading through his writings in Polish, in Hebrew, in Yiddish, and other languages, trying to kind of get the fullest possible picture of this very important man who came up with these new ideas and really shaped our world. I'll ask Suzette for the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So the puzzle is that anti-Semitism is both, just like in that poem, everywhere and nowhere in Raphael Lemkin's writing and about his life and his ideas. On the one hand, he spent decades before World War II defending Polish Jews from anti-Semitism. He was an editor of a Yiddish newspaper, and he wrote an advice column about Polish law, what Jews needed to know to protect themselves. He was a lawyer who worked in public practice as a prosecutor and then in private practice, defending Jews, often from charges that were motivated in some cases by sheer anti-Jewish hate. He lost his job as a prosecutor because of anti-Semitism. He is somebody who was very involved in Zionism and Zionist politics and understood this as a political response, not just a dream, obviously, of Jewish self-determination, but a little very specific response to persecution inside Poland. And when he talked later on about the idea of genocide, he often would refer back to episodes in Jewish history, not just the Shoah, but he would talk about World War I, he would talk about the pogroms in Eastern Europe, he would talk all the way back to Horban Abayit, the destruction of the Second Temple in the 1st century. So it's all over the place as a kind of theme and presence in his writing and his work. But here's the curious thing. Lemkin rarely uses that word, anti-Semitism, itself. Not in English, not in Hebrew, Polish, or Yiddish, or other languages. And he rarely defines it specifically the way we think of it as kind of the starting point for talking about law and protecting minorities. You all are probably aware that there are huge debates today about how to define anti-Semitism in international law and in American law, right? And how that relates to college campuses and civil rights. So it seems axiomatic, right, that we would begin by a definition and then we would try and move from there. But Lemkin doesn't offer a definition. So that's a puzzle. And I want to try and understand that puzzle. And it opens up into 2 more questions I'll put to you, and then I'm going to tell you more of a story about his life. The 2 questions are kind of implied in what I've said. What is the link between anti-Semitism and all other kinds of hatred for Lemkin? Are they the same thing or are they different? And secondly, what's the relationship between the Shoah, the Holocaust, and other genocides? Now, for those of you who are lawyers or interested in law, we know one of the basic things you have to be able to do to make a law is to generalize. You have to be able to say this is a crime and the crime is X and it's a result of discrimination on the basis of race or sex, or we have to say it's a crime that involves someone taking the lives of an individual or a group. But we generally think of it as essential to generalize. But when we talk about anti-Semitism, we often get into this puzzle. Well, is it the same kind of thing as racism, color-based racism, or other racisms? And we talk about the Holocaust. We say, well, we want laws to protect the memory of it. We want laws to grow out of it. But do we want to think of it as the same thing as genocide in general? I'm going to take you back now to the 1920s and the moment when Lemkin really began to ask these questions. And though he didn't always give us explicit answers about what it means or why he was doing it, he did some fascinating moves at the time that can kind of shed light on the origins of anti-genocide law and the questions with which I began the presentation this afternoon. So we're going to go back to the 20s, and then we'll jump from there to the 30s and 40s, and finally we'll come back to this poem, and then we'll do Q&A. Suzette, please take us forward 1 more slide. Thank you. So one of the joys of doing historical research is you get to go digging for all kinds of random little bits of information and lost sources. So here I show you a couple pictures of Raphael Lemkin as a young man in the 1920s. The picture on the right, the kind of grainier picture, is from the pages of a book published of all the editors of Heint, the Yiddish newspaper in Warsaw. And Lemkin was an editor there. He's a little hard to see, but his upper rightmost corner is him. And then there's another picture of him over here with the members of the Warsaw PEN Writers Congress. PEN is the international organization for writers and freedom of expression. And Lemkin is there on the back row, right side, about 3 or so people in from the far right. And then I've magnified his picture. So this is a kind of representation of who he was. As I mentioned, he was a lawyer, active in Polish law at the time, and he was, a writer, writing for this Yiddish newspaper, writing in Hebrew and Polish as well. And active in Polish writing. Most of the men you see there are distinguished Polish intellectuals, translators, writers. Most of them were not Jewish. These are the photos, folks in the photos on the left. But Lemkin's there because he was sort of a hotshot of a writer at the time and kind of a rising star. He was also a rising star in the world of Polish lawyers and the bar and international penal law. And one of the things we now know is he spent a lot of time traveling around Europe already in the 1920s and into the 30s, going to conferences on trying to codify international criminal law. He was already involved in thinking about how could law be made better and standard across countries so that Europe would avoid another conflagration like World War I, and it would become a more just society, and also other countries beyond Europe would join in. I'll ask for next slide, please. Here I give you a taste of some of the things he's was writing about when he wrote 4 Jews and 2 Jews. And again, what's striking about it is how he is deeply enmeshed in Jewish life. He's not just thinking about discrimination or Polish hatred or things like that. He's very much engaged also in the project of Jewish renewal. And he actually sees law as an expression of Jewish nationhood and Jewish renewal. So there is a pamphlet here from Har HaTzofim, which was the opening ceremony of Mount Scopus's campus of the Hebrew University in 1925. There's actually a text here in the bottom middle of your screen, which is 10 years of the Balfour Declaration that Lemkin puts out about the Balfour Declaration in 1927, and a variety of other things. The key thing is that he's doing all of this activity, and 1927 turns out to be the most important year, because 2 things happen for him that in that year begin to make him think about violence and about atrocity and about the idea of law stopping it, that have major implications for what becomes the genocide law. Next slide, please. I said 2 events, and the first of them is a trial. And the trial takes place in Paris that year, and Lemkin travels from Warsaw, Poland to Paris, France, to attend the trial and write about it as a journalist for that Yiddish newspaper. The trial was of a man named Sholem Schwarzbard. Perhaps you've heard of him. He was the Polish-Jewish assassin. He was the young man who decided to take revenge for the massacre of over 100,000 Jews in the pogroms after World War I in the borderlands of what was becoming Poland and Ukraine and the Soviet Union. That picture is of a memorial, you see there, kind of a gruesome graphic picture of a memorial to victims of those pogroms. And Pitlura, who lost family in it, Schwarzbard sought out the man named Pitlura, the Ukrainian nationalist leader, and killed him in the streets of Paris. Pitlura was accused of being one of the Ukrainian nationalist heroes who was also an anti-Semitic villain. And Schwarzbard killed him. And then he was put on trial, and it became an international sensation. There was another trial that year, which probably outshone it in terms of its truly global attention from the media, and that was the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. But second only to that, this trial was explosive because it was a referendum on what had happened to Jews in the world during and after World War I. And it was a debate about justice and what justice is and how you can have justice when you have a massive, massive crime of killing and trying to kill all members of a people. So Schwarzbard goes on trial, and there's a debate, a painful debate between Jews and Ukrainians about who was responsible and whether this is a scapegoat or not. But for Lemkin, he's just transfixed by this trial, because it's the question of how do you get justice when it's not one person killing another person, but it's one person commanding a group of people to kill a huge amount of another people and to try and destroy them. What could justice look like? Schwarzbard, very interesting trial. The key thing about it is that Schwarzbard pleads not guilty, and he is actually found innocent by the jury. His case consists of showing that there was a conspiracy on the part of the Ukrainian national leadership and Pitlura to undertake massive violence against the Jews who they encountered. And therefore, this was a terrible crime, and this was a passionate act of revenge and justice. And even though we might recoil from that idea of justice through vengeance, the jury found him not guilty, and he was exonerated effectively. He was held, he paid a small fine, I could say more about this, to the widow, a kind of token fine to the widow, but he was freed. Lemkin writes about this, and he says that there's something very powerful about what has just taken place, because there's a way in which law has strived to reckon with the idea of a mass crime of this caliber and this scale. And therefore, this is a victory for justice. You might think Lemkin as a lawyer might say, well, I sympathize with Schwarzbard. I sympathize with the desire for a victim to have justice, but that's going too far, right? Or he might say, well, the facts were not proven. Lemkin doesn't say those things. He simply says victims need a way to secure justice, not just the states who maintain law and order, and not just the individuals who might sue another individual. There has to be a way for a community to seek justice. Now, something else happened that same year, and it's the other side of his ideas. And I'm going to ask Suzette, who's working with us today, to proceed to the next slide. Thank you. Lemkin is transfixed by Paris, but he's also focused on something that's happening in Warsaw at the same time. And there is a major controversy happening, which he gets involved in. And it's another controversy about anti-Semitism, not about physical violence, but about what we might call, with a little poetic license, cultural violence. And this is the Żeleński affair in Warsaw. What is this? Well, this is one of those little weird episodes in modern Polish history that most people, including most historians, don't even know about, unless you follow things having to do with arts and letters and the history of academic thought in Poland, because so much else is happening at the time. As you may know, the right wing is rising in Poland, and it's a right wing which is flirting with fascism and becoming overtly anti-Semitic. There are debates between the right and the left in Polish society about communism versus fascism. There are debates about political stability as a whole, and there are debates about what the Jews should do in this moment. But people are also focused at the time on what becomes known as a terrific controversy. And it has to do with this Polish scholar, Tadeusz Żeleński, who is pictured here. What happens? He is a Catholic scholar, and he is the chair of the Department of Classical Philology at the University of Warsaw. Żeleński is also one of the great minds of Europe at the time, one of the most renowned experts on the history of religion. And for the past decade, he had been publishing a series of books about the history of Western religion. Okay, so then comes a volume of the book in 1927 called Hellenism and Judaism. And in this book, Żeleński has a very simple thesis, very, very erudite scholarship, the kind that professors such as myself love. But there's a very simple thesis. And the thesis is Christianity is the ultimate apex of humanity's moral and religious and ethical aspirations. And Christianity doesn't come from Judaism, doesn't come from the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, any of that stuff. It comes from the Greeks. It's kind of a weird argument, but his argument is everything that you think about as true Christianity, and he would put in that category love of humanity, love of nature, of reckoning with humans as brothers who should treat each other with joy and with heart and with ethics, a striving to build a perfect world, the idea of tolerance, the idea of one God for the whole world, gender equality, all these things, Żeleński says, are Greek ideas that come from Greek religion. They have nothing to do with Judaism, because if you look at Judaism, he says, what do you find? A vengeful God, a tribal God who favors one people, a God who is bloodthirsty and actually commands his people to slaughter their enemies, a God that demands a fealty to law and doesn't seem to have much place for human fallibility and error. This is a caricature of Judaism, right? And it's a caricature that Christianity has. But Żeleński basically goes on to say that's true throughout time, and that Judaism is immoral, backwards, bloodthirsty, and that Jews themselves who adhere to these principles and practice traditional Judaism in Poland are barbaric, tribalistic, anti-human, anti-civilized, and hateful. And he goes on to say that for Poland to be reborn as a modern country, it needs to reattach itself to its true ethical and religious roots, and it needs to de-Judaize itself. He says, I'm not against all Jews, and this is a theme we hear every day right now, right, from those who voice anti-Semitic sentiments. I'm not against all Jews, just those bad Jews, right? Just those Jews who don't get with the program, or just those Jews who seem to be holding on to backwards or unethical attitudes or commitments. But I'm not against them. I'm just against Judaism. You can Christianize Judaism, he says, and then you get something that is more appropriate. This unleashes a huge debate. And the debate is one in which every important Jewish thinker in Poland takes part because they view this as openly anti-Semitic. There are some who say, much like we hear a lot today in the news, this person, whether they know it or not, is expressing anti-Semitic ideas. And there are others who say it's just flat out anti-Semitism. He knows what he's doing. And Lemkin falls into that second category. In fact, he becomes the most important voice in this, who challenges Zelensky and writes about it, in which he says, this is out and out anti-Semitism, and this is an attack and a caricature and a slander of Judaism. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go completely into all of his arguments, but I want to suggest that what happens in this episode is Lemkin basically, just like he confronted lethal physical violence and said there must be a way law can stop that kind of attack on Jews. Maybe we shouldn't have vengeance, right? Retribution, somebody taking the law into their own hands. But then the law has to evolve. He also begins to say we have to recognize that anti-Semitism, an attack on our group, on our community, isn't only going to be when people come to try and attack our bodies. This is a cultural violence. And he says this is an attack on Jewish difference. This is not only a caricature, but Professor Zelensky is really basically undermining the very idea of diversity in modern society. It's not about everyone becoming universally brothers in arms. That's actually about a vision of Christianity erasing all other religions. And so what we need to do is come up with an argument of how to defend diversity and defend minorities from not only these stereotypes and attacks, but the attacks against their very identity. Next slide, please. Why am I telling you all this? Well, besides the fact that I find it intrinsically interesting to understand where people develop their moral ideas, this is the starting point for what happened 6 years later. In 1933, as some of you may know, Lemkin goes to the League of Nations with a proposal. The proposal is a law to ban the crimes of barbarism and vandalism. And this is sort of the fuller proposal in which he talks about actually terrorism and political violence in society at the time. But he says there are essentially two major crimes that threaten minorities. And I'll ask Suzette to do the next slide for us now. The first is barbarism, which is physical violence against groups, or as he defines it in that 1933 proposal, acts of extermination directed against the ethnic, religious, or social collectivities we will call by the name barbarism. They endanger both the existence of the collectivity, the group concerned, and the entire social order. Okay, so that's a subtle thing, but it's important that we understand what it is, right? It's an idea that if you intend to go out to try and destroy an ethnic group, a religious group, a social collectivity, which could be a nation, a national group, could be a racial minority, that these are acts of extermination that are so egregious that they need to have a specific kind of law against them. It can't just be murder. You need an idea of mass murder. And that's what he's going to call barbarism at that time. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, go back one if you don't mind. Perfect. Note here, and this is important for the lawyers who are with us today and people interested in legal reasoning. Note here that the crime is both a crime of physical violence against a group and, note those last three words, the entire social order, right? So it's sort of like a double effect. Attacking a minority is a specific kind of crime, but through attacking that minority, you're attacking the entire social fabric of society, right? Or to put it in different words, you're attacking the moral order, right? It's a violation of morality, which fits with a lot of what we think about when we talk about international crimes against humanity, the concept I can say more about, human rights, right? Or genocide, that this is a crime against a specific group, but also a violation of the moral order of humanity. Okay, now next slide, please. The second category of crime he writes about in 33 is vandalism. And here you see his definition in part: the destruction of a work of art of any nation must be regarded as acts of vandalism directed against world culture. In the ... he goes on to say, attacking the museum, attacking the books, the art of people, as well as their sacred texts, the cultural identity and patrimony of the people, the ways in which they perpetuate their identity and pass it on from one generation to another. And he says, coming back to the text you see before you, harming the culture of the collectivity directly concerned, right? An attack against culture, yet it's also humanity which experiences a loss. Next slide, please. So what I want to suggest here is that in these two different crimes, barbarism and vandalism, you see Lemkin beginning to lay out a complex vision of what will become the crime of genocide. Complex because first it involves physical violence and then cultural violence. Second, because it involves a crime against morality, right? This is a violation of the social order, and a crime against, as I put it up here in the slide, diversity, right? It's not just the group who suffers because they need this culture to maintain their identity. It's actually all of humanity that suffers when a people's languages disappeared, right? Or when they lose their religion, when it is forcibly stripped from them, or when they lose their monuments even that reflect their religious ideas, right? In places across the world, synagogues, buildings, things like that. That's an attack not only against the group's foundations, but against diversity itself, in which all of humanity loses something. Now, if you're following me, let me add one more wrinkle to this. One way to think about this is to say that the diversity argument here is neutral as to the identity of the victim, while the social order argument is predicated on a hierarchy of values. What do I mean by that? He doesn't say in the quote in front of you which culture should be preserved. The assumption is every culture should be preserved. So an indigenous people who don't have great works of classical music, but have their own rituals and practices and their own language and their own oral narratives, those are equal to Beethoven, right? Or those are equal to Maimonides. So there's an egalitarian aspect of this, that it doesn't depend on the identity. This attack will be bad, just like the attack on the identity of a group will be bad, no matter who they are. But social order and morality, that's a trickier one, because you might say, are all of these things equal? And what does it mean to have a moral order? Well, you generally say, well, these values are more important than these others. And it's often connected to an idea that these values are superior to the barbaric ones, that these cultures who go and do this people said, and they said this in Nuremberg, that the Nazis were non-Christian or anti-Western or uncivilized. I think that this is a subtle but important dimension. And the reason is Lemkin is struggling with a world, and remember, this is 1933, a world in which Europe is saying not only do we not necessarily value Jewish lives that much, Jewish bodies, but they're also saying, much like that Professor Zielinski, they're saying that Jewish culture is uncivilized. And they're saying that one of the reasons we would not want to hurt Jews is because that would be unchristian. In other words, Jews are subordinated. They're not only racialized, right, as they're being demonized by the Nazis and other fascists and Polish far rightists as an alien race, but their own identity is also being devalued, and they're being attacked as people who are not only racially inferior, but culturally inferior. So this is a tricky thing to develop a moral hierarchy. And it's one which I'll say something about at the Q&A perhaps, which challenges us today when we want to think about how to define genocide in relation to different controversies and who counts and which issues and which groups get our attention. It's also, and I'll jump to the next slide, please. It's also something which suggests a tension between Jewish identity and moral universalism. You may have heard from Professor Elif in the introduction. I've written about the history of human rights. One of the interesting challenges that many of you may be aware of is how Jews advocate for against anti-Semitism and for human rights without being accused of parochialism, without being accused of special pleading or being obsessed with the Jews themselves at the expense of other groups or at the expense of larger dramas of humanity. This is in fact what Lemkin struggled with. 1933 happens. The League of Nations dismisses this. There's a little bit of interest. Most countries say that just sounds like a Jew who's complaining about anti-Semitism in this country. We have bigger fish to fry. So his proposal for a law goes nowhere. The Polish government ends up effectively, because of this, firing him from his job in government as prosecutor and demonizing him. Why? Because they say, oh, this is a Jew who's going to the League of Nations, the precursor to the UN, and he's going to them basically to attack Poland. And he's doing this just for the Jews. This isn't up for all of humanity. We know what's really going on. This is a Jewish campaign for tribal, selfish, Jewish parochial reasons. So Lemkin, I think, is really impacted by that. And it's a struggle to understand how Jews can suffer, but how it can be related to a universal drama that any community could suffer. That, I think, is what explains why he decides to make up a word. And the word appears in the early 40s after he's escaped Poland and moved first through Lithuania, to Sweden, and then to the United States. And here he coins this new word, genocide. It appears 42 first, and then it's in 43 and 44 in a series of publications in which he defines it by saying it's a combination of Greek and Latin roots, geno for human or race or people or nation, side or kaidi from murder, as in infanticide, right, regicide, and so on and so forth. And he makes this word up because he says we need a word for a universal category of what a crime could be. Now, it's important to remember, he makes this up. The Holocaust, as we know it, is not yet a thing, right? 42, 43, people are just learning what the Nazis have done. They don't know the scope of it. They don't know exactly how much of Jewish life has been destroyed. For Lemkin, it's already enough, right? And he's thinking about what we move forward in terms of law and punishment and prevention. But he's not doing this in the way that we might think of as reckoning with something as a crime without precedent and things like that. He's seeing this as actually an all too familiar crime, an attack against Jews, just like the Armenians were massacred in World War I, and yet something which cries out for a new kind of law at the time. And so his challenge is to take this unique event, but also make it fit into a larger, as I said, general legal category. And it's one of the challenges at the time. That's also true at the Nuremberg trials. I think some of you might have mentioned this in your chat questions. It's one of the challenges in which those who want to bring the Nazis to justice do not necessarily think it's because of what they've done to the Jews, and do not necessarily think it's important to tell what happened to the Jews. It's often understood that the Nuremberg trials were about exposing the Nazi barbarities and what they did to the Jews. They were not. The Nuremberg trials were about punishing the Nazis for the crime of aggression and for what they did in launching these barbaric wars. The Jews were just an exhibit. They were a case inside this. And so most of the people, including Lemkin, who were involved in the Nuremberg trials, came away disappointed because they felt like here are the nations of the world led by the US and the British and the Soviets, and they've gotten together and they're not actually telling the story of the victims. They use us selectively, but they're really just making sure that the Nazis are punished for doing war crimes as opposed to atrocity crimes. I could say more about that, but the key thing is while that's happening, Lemkin is deciding that he wants to translate genocide as a concept into a law. And he's not the only one at the time. There are other lawyers at the time, but he begins a campaign and he begins to message it very effectively. He's a norms entrepreneur, if you will. And out of this comes, in 1948, the Genocide Convention. Now, I could say more about what is in and what is not in the Genocide Convention, but I want to simply say one thing. Lemkin proposes his convention, and he borrows a lot of the same ideas from 33 for the destruction of groups, for mass murder. He calls it, I don't have the slide up, but you'll bear with me if I tell you his definition of the deliberate intent to destroy in part or in full a group. He brings some examples which enter into the statute, which involve things like forcibly transferring children. So if you remove the children from one group, you're effectively destroying the group through the kidnapping of the children, which is a sensitive issue for Jews after the Shoah. And there are other examples that come into that. But what doesn't come into it is a lot of the cultural stuff, which I've mentioned. There's an oblique version of it, but a lot of that gets dropped out for reasons having to do with the politics of the moment and the Cold War at that time. Let's go back to the poem, and I'll ask Suzette to turn to our last slide here. So I've told you that we get to genocide in 1948 through 1927, right? And it's grappling with lethal violence and what can law do about it, and from this grappling with anti-Semitic persecution and cultural violence. And both of those go into the 33 proposal. And then by 48, you have elements of them, but pretty much the cultural part drops out. And you have this focus on physical violence and other forms of kind of intent to destroy a community. And Lemkin spends the rest of his life until 1959 running around the United Nations and elsewhere, going to Europe and elsewhere, championing this law and trying to get states to sign on to it. Because we often think about this as a triumphant moment in 1948, the Genocide Convention becomes law. But the way international law works, countries have to agree to it. They have to sign on to it, and you have to get to a threshold. And even then, you need a mechanism for enforcement. The mechanism for enforcement does not come in 1948 or in Lemkin's lifetime. He believes there will be an international criminal court which can enforce this. It doesn't happen. He believes that governments will all make legal changes to their constitutions that will turn this into part of their domestic law. It doesn't happen, with a few exceptions. And so he is left also feeling quite disappointed that the world is beginning to lose hope about ever stopping genocide. And he's also afraid that the world, and this is notable in light of the themes of today's teaching as a whole, the world is beginning to forget the memory of the Holocaust. In fact, if you can, it's a little hard to make out in the image in front of you, but the authors, the editorial note in this slide about this poem, Genocide, says that he was moved to write it because he feared that the world was already forgetting the terrible crime committed against the Jews. 1957, he's already worried, right? But there's another way to look at this. And it goes back to the question I began about why does he call it genocide? If you look at this poem and you read it, there's a lot of classical imagery. You can see almost touches of Isaiah and the prophets. And you can see some of the echoes of Chaim Nachman Bialik, the Hebrew poet and Zionist bard, who was sort of this very elegiac language in which it seems so suffused with images of traditional Jewish life and about destruction and mourning. And as I mentioned, it's also oblique, doesn't mention the word Jew, let alone anti-Semitism. And it seems to be clearly addressing the victims of the Holocaust, right? How you've been singled out, they came to kill you because of their own sense of supremacy. God commanded them to rule over all other nations. Your only sin, your very name. They'll blot out your seed on account of race and religion. Here, what I think of as powerful about this poem is that in a certain way, what he's doing is combining the particulars of the Jewish experience, the crimes that happened against Jewish bodies, Jewish lives, Jewish culture, but he's trying to do it in a way in which it is achingly Jewish, but also is universal. Genocide is a universal category. He believes that it has to be something that can be understood, that can happen anywhere to any group. It's not something that he views as only limited to one time period in history. And he therefore says that we need to kind of think about this as the particular and the universal happening together. And law has to be general, but it should also be accompanied by the memory of the particular, which gives it the moral force and the need for it. Now, I'll ask you, I'll ask Suzette just to go, we can stop the slideshow and you can just look at more of me. What I want to suggest in this presentation is that what Lemkin's doing in that poem and in general is translating. He's translating between Shoah and genocide. He's making these two different things, the specific and the global, mixed to each other, and he's linking them up. I think this is a helpful message for us today. Lemkin did not get everything right, and I can say more about that. I think we have some time for Q&A. He didn't get everything right. There were blind spots, some of which I've written about and some of which I could tell you about, in how he saw genocide, how he understood racial violence in the United States. There were blind spots in how he thought law would work. He kind of had this blind faith that if you just make this law and every country signs on to it, that will end the problems. He also basically assumed that the real places where genocide could happen would be totalitarian societies. And it left open the question about other places and what the threshold is for a genocide, if it can be something involving not only the Holocaust, but smaller scale violence that's directed against part of a group, intending to eliminate it. We're in a moment in which there is a lot of confusion. And as I began by saying, and as I wrote in the essay that was shared with those of you doing this for CLE, there's a temptation to say the Holocaust matters so much to global justice, but then to say, but that's not the Holocaust, or genocide is kind of in tension with it. There's also a kind of implicit judgment in which we want to basically say that anti-Semitism has to teach us something about other hatreds, but we don't want to put them too close together because it'll cheapen this, or it'll become subservient, subordinate to that. But I think what Lemkin's trying to do is imagine a form of international law in which the two are intertwined. And it's not a kind of zero-sum competition where we bring everyone to see the Shoah and then we expect them to understand what it means, but not to ask questions about what genocides of Native Americans mean in relationship to it. Or not to say, is this an atrocity crime that our people is committing or that this other people commits here and that we need to be just as outraged about. Lemkin would say that not all of these things are the same, but he would also say that they have to be understood as part of a global humanity struggling with a common threat. And the job of law is to find a way to apply that universally without erasing the difference and without kind of creating hierarchies where we say this one matters more than this one. So I'm going to suggest in closing that we're in a really challenging place. Ukraine today is one example. What's happening between Israelis and Palestinians, that's another example. What's happening in China, that's another example. And there's intense politicization around all these issues, right? But what I would hope we don't lose sight of is the possibility of recognizing the distinction between things, but holding to a common standard that can allow us to secure legal justice, which is ultimately what I think one of the most important messages for Holocaust memory should be today. Now, I'm going to pause here. Suzette and other folks from Gretz, I hope are keeping our time, so we'll know that we are keeping to our pledge to do our full hour.
I'm gonna, hi everybody, I'm Naomi.
Naomi, yeah.
I'm gonna ask anybody in the audience if they have a question. If you do, just raise your hand and yes, please stand up or just speak up a little bit so we can hear you. Yeah.
Professor, it's an honor to meet you virtually. My name is Dovi Sasa Tuzman. A question around the moral construct of vandalism.
Yeah.
It would seem like there's potentially some tension with like cancel dynamics. So how would Lemkin see, for example, the taking down of statues in the South that represent oppressors from that period,
yeah,
but that a certain element of Southern U.S. culture would see as tearing apart of their identity? So what happens when you're kind of vandalizing, in a certain sense, using Lemkin's language, something that kind of, I guess one would say, perhaps deserves to be removed?
Yeah, thank you, Doug. That's a great question. As you all probably heard, I come to you from the University of Virginia. I teach in Charlottesville. These are, and not just there, right? In the broader context of it, I use the word monuments, right? And he uses the word monuments. So what happens when the monument is valued by a community, even if it's in a liberal community, right? Even if it's for the wrong reasons. There is a tension there. I think that for Lemkin, two things are important to remember. The first is that there's a distinction between legal actions and law and what happens in just general discourse, right? So he's a lawyer, and like lawyers then and now, he will say, well, let's be very specific. What does the law allow and what does it not? So saying that we as a community no longer want this here because we don't think it reflects our values, and we are going to vote democratically to take it down and empower our legislators, is different than tearing down a statue, right? As an act of perhaps vigilante justice, even for the best of intentions. But also when it comes to cancel culture, right? I think we know there's a distinction between the ways in which our media operates in our communities and our naming and shaming and canceling, and the way the law actually works when it's about regulating speech in a university context, in a media environment that has government regulation, or when it's the government itself. So that's an important distinction. The other thing I'd say very quickly is that Lemkin, I've emphasized how universal he wants to be, but he also says there are power dynamics and there are minority groups. That's what he's most concerned about, right? There are people in his day, and the example of the professor I brought, who are basically saying, Lemkin, you're trying to cancel me. And in fact, this literally happens in 1927. The professor Zielinski says, I'm not here to debate anti-Semitism or philo-Semitism. I'm not interested in that. I'm just telling the truth. And you guys just want to cancel me. That's not the word he uses, but he says, you just want to stop me from speaking because I'm saying things which are provocative, but without malice. And Lemkin says, you're not being honest here. You're deliberately targeting a minority group, and there's a power dynamic. You represent this vast majority of people in this country who are Polish Catholics, and we're a vulnerable minority. So I think he would say there's a context, and the context does matter. It matters in the southern United States also, right? About what certain symbols are. But so I would think he would say to us, stick to the law. And if you don't like the law, work it through the courts or address the question of the law. And secondly, recognize the context here, that it can work in all directions, but our goal should be to protect the most vulnerable communities in our society as a kind of guardrail for democracy as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Mindy, how are we doing on time?
There's someone named Josh who is online. Josh is online. If Josh wants to unmute himself and ask his question, he can. It looks like his hand is raised.
Yeah.
So, Josh?
Yes, hi. Thanks so much for your presentation. I sent you a message about this too, but I was just wondering can you refresh? I don't know if I missed this, but where exactly did the word genocide first appear in 1942? Was it in a publication, and in what format? Was it the poem, or, and did he publish it in some other way?
Sure, thank you, Josh. It's a great question. And an easy one. So it appears in a book called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. Lemkin got to this country and he did some teaching in different law schools in North Carolina and eventually in Rutgers and New Haven, Yale. But he worked with the Carnegie Endowment. And so what he did is publish a book, which was essentially a compendium of all of the Nazi laws, these perverse laws they'd created. And in the book, he suggests this term genocide for understanding the overall crime of what they're doing. And it's the crimes that they are actively committing at that point in the east of Europe where they occupy. So that's where the term first appears in this book in 1942. And then it comes out in an essay shortly thereafter. He publishes it in an essay in an American magazine. And then he testifies in front of Congress. So he begins to slowly roll it out from that point onwards.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, one more question.
Okay, yes, please.
Hi, Professor. My name is Leah, and I am Albanian, and I grew up in post-war Kosovo, and firsthand experience with genocide. My question is, why is the genocide of Srebrenica recognized worldwide, And why are the atrocities, and why are not the atrocities and war crimes in Drenica and Mitrovica, which are cities in Kosovo, where the war was far more violent and far many more people were killed? Why is that not recognized as a genocide? And another question, this is 50 years post the coining of the term genocide, and we're still in Europe. Why are members of the European Parliament, such as Nicholas Bay, who Christian white supremacist, why do they have the right to say that Kosovo is Serbia and no one bats an eye?
Mhm. Thank you, Leah, for your questions. Yeah, I mean, these are hard things which emerge first and foremost from the politics, right? And in the book I'm writing about Lemkin, one of the challenges is to understand how an activist gets a law to be made. And the law requires countries to join in, and that's where the politics come in. And unfortunately, the politics, as I think you probably know, they continue to operate in what gets highlighted as a genocide, what gets recognized. It's not only our awareness, right? It's not only telling the story better and making people aware, even though we need to do that. It's also working through governments and making governments see that it's in their common interest to do this. And that's quite challenging. I think that we know that what happened for Lemkin was that much of his efforts got caught up in the Cold War. And he tried hard to avoid it, but he also was involved in the Cold War politics himself. He was a supporter of Ukrainians against the Soviets, even though he'd written about Ukrainian violence against Jews, right? So, and after the Cold War, right, when so much lethal violence and genocide was unleashed and took place, again, the politics continued to enter into it. But I will say one other thing about it. In the 1948 Genocide Convention, it not only includes, the statute not only includes the crime of doing it, it includes the crime of incitement. And so some of what you say about lawmakers, not just denying a genocide, but perhaps continuing to incite violence in certain ways, that's potentially an actionable crime. The challenge lies once again in the politics, in really making those hard choices of getting people on board to work on this, as well as the law. Right. And if I could leave everyone with a final message, memory is essential, but law is the place in which we turn memory and morals into action. Right. And so that is a key thing for us to think about, how we can strengthen law and what are the ways in which we can do it. And maybe it's not only this one law. Maybe we need to strengthen, EU law and other forms of law as a whole, that can sustain this moral vision and expand its application to a lot of necessary cases.
Okay, thank you, Professor Loeffler. Please join me in thanking him for this.
Thank you.